You are watching original video by truthdig.com. For more information and resources, visit us on the web at www.truthdig.com.
I've learned so much from Chris Hedges over the years, and before I specifically talk about Chris, I want to talk about how important independent media is, and of course those two go hand in hand. We just don't hear voices like Chris Hedges from the multi-million-dollar platforms that are built to deliver your eyeballs to advertisers, right? Because that's all they are. The multi-billion-dollar platforms that are conveyor belts for advertisers to convince you to buy stuff you don't need. And in the delivery of that, you might happen to consume some news. But of course, far be it that it might be news that might cause you to question why you might want to or want to not buy those things. And we feel that voices like Chris's are all too rare. Now, of course, Chris Hedges is a very rare person, certainly. But we feel isolated in our beliefs, in our ideas, in our thoughts about the world, in our questioning. And that's just how CNN wants it to be. We feel like we can't, be possibly thinking and imagining a world that's more just than the ones we live in, than the one we live in now, because there just isn't an alternative. And so why not just kick back and relax? A few weeks ago, I was at a film festival and I saw an ad by Nielsen Ratings, who had sponsored the film festival. And they were so excited because this ad was showing an audience. It was the Asian Pacific Film Festival. And this ad, if you watch the ad without really thinking about who Nielsen was, you might imagine that they were about to deliver the most revolutionary concept into the hands of people. And that revolutionary concept was the ability to choose what kind of TV you wanted, right? To choose as an Asian community or another community of color that you could demand characters that look like yourself on television that you could watch between ads that you're really supposed to watch. And it just was so bright-eyed and it was so inspiring. It made you feel so powerful that you, through your remote control, could control your television set. Not your world, but your television set. And I was watching this and, you couldn't help but be swept up by the excitement. And I, turned to the people around me in the darkness and I thought, are you kidding me? Really? This is what we are supposed to be celebrating, what technology has brought us, what living in a globalized world where we can communicate with one another, better than ever before has brought us. And this was the best that the corporate world had to offer us, the power to choose inane programming. What about a whole other world that exists just below the surface, and if you scratch the internet, or if you happen to fall along the radio dial by 90.7 FM, you can find that reflects the aspirations, the desires, the pain, and the hopes of all of the rest of us, right? It's there. It's there if we want it to be. It can be bigger and better if we want it to be. These outlets that struggle, that every day bring you voices like Chris Hedges are there if you want them to be. They can be bigger and bigger and bigger, but we have to want them, we have to build them, because that's not just our duty to lift one another, but that has the power to make us all feel less isolated, make us all imagine that better world. So I'm so glad all of you are here today supporting TruthDig, because we need more TruthDigs. We need to dig deeper and deeper. And I have been so happy to be part of this welcoming space where my views and my writings, and where I'm able to express them, not just with freedom, but in ways that are embraced, that are celebrated, that are appreciated, and that are shared widely. When I first heard Chris Hedges, it was when he was giving his talk, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, based on his best-selling book, a book that, just changed so many people's minds. And at first I was just like, wait, I heard the title and I was just like, no, war does not give us meaning. No, and then someone said, no, listen to what he's saying. This is a war correspondent. This is a man who has seen war in so many arenas, in so many places, up front and close and personal, to a degree that you wonder he isn't left traumatized. But he is, of course. We are all left traumatized by what we see firsthand or secondhand, but he's seen it firsthand. And the power that he conveyed in his voice, as someone who has seen it, who's been there, many journalists who've been through what he's been through in terms of reporting simply drive themselves to drink. It's a very traumatizing experience to be a war correspondent. Many turn to addictive behavior. Some are addicted to the actual act of reporting itself, like being at war, when you can't wait to get the next thrilling, death-defying moment. And of course, we know many brave journalists who've literally been kidnapped and disappeared, beheaded, etc. And Chris could have easily been one of those, but he survived. And then he turned his anger and his pain into words, into powerful words. And Chris Hedges, to him, nothing is sacred, right? The Democratic Party isn't sacred. Liberalism is not sacred. And we need that. We need those truth tellers. In his years as a foreign affairs correspondent for the New York Times, his reporting for which he won a Pulitzer, he saw firsthand wars and conflicts in the Middle East, the Balkans, Central America. I mean, you drop a pin on a map and it's likely Chris Hedges knows something about it and or has been there in the past 20, 30 years. His books have been such powerful glimpses into not only the kind of world that we want to live in, but a tearing down of the world that we are living in so that we can peel it away and make way for a better world. Death of a Liberal Class, I thought, was such an important wake-up call for all of us. But my favorite, before this book came along, my favorite was Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, partly because I've loved Joe Sacco, his collaborator for many years, and his work Palestine, but also partly because the graphic illustration, I think, really brings to life. I'm an artist, and I just have always been drawn to that form as well. And then Chris Hedges came up with this book, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. And in it, he asks such important questions. He asks questions of what it is that makes somebody want to take such deep risks that they will, literally have either spent their lives in prison or been exiled. He talks about Edward Snowden. He talks about Chelsea Manning. He has met Lynn Stewart, has interviewed Mumia Abu-Jamal. He reminds us of the fact that revolutions have always been and will always be, and challenges us to see this moment as a moment ripe for revolt, if only we would take it. So please join me in welcoming today Chris Hedges, whose latest book is Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So Sonali mentioned a couple of the last three books, Death of a Liberal Class, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, The Triumph of Spectacle, and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, which I wrote, as she said, with Joe Sacco. And those books all attempted to look at where we are as a society, what's happened to the liberal institutions that once made incremental and piecemeal reform possible, the rise of the society of spectacle, the severance from a print-based culture, the sacrifice zones and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, those places where unfettered, unregulated capitalism is allowed to destroy the environment, human lives, community. And of course, now we live in an age where we've all become a sacrifice zone. The planet has become a sacrifice zone. And the question is, how do we react? This book is different from those other three and that I've stopped attempting to analyze the problem and started to analyze the solution. And the solution, I believe, is revolution. It is the overthrow of corporate tyranny. And every action that we take from now on must be to destroy that tyranny in whatever form and whatever shape it manifests itself. So I was in Boston a couple days ago, and before my talk, I was with anti-fracking activists. Kinder Morgan and Spectrum are running pipelines literally through suburban centers of Boston so that the tar sands and bitumen can be exported to China. And of course, they're frantic, not only for their community, but for the planet. And they kept asking, you know, we have petitions, we're appealing to Elizabeth Warren, we're appealing to Markey, and certainly coming out of this book, I said, stop. I said, the only thing you should focus all of your energy on now is buying junk cars, driving them into the streets in front of that construction equipment, taking out the battery and walking away. Every action that we take from now on must be to break the machine. There's no more collaboration because they don't listen. Young men and women can walk through the streets of American cities, young men and women of color, in these acts of lynching carried out by our militarized police forces. 2 people a day. They've lied to us. What a surprise. The Washington Post just did a story and said it's not 1 every 28 hours. It's at least 2 people a day because they don't report. It's self-reporting. They report what they want to report. Day after day, they march through the streets of American cities decrying the lethal force, the execution of unarmed citizens. And it doesn't matter how many marches take place, they keep killing. The population of this country has seen videos of fellow citizens being strangled to death and murdered by militarized police forces that are not charged. Over and over, in every single aspect of our life, the message that is sent to us by the corporate state is that we don't matter. The laws have been rewritten. The Constitution has been reinterpreted by judicial fiat, twisting its very intention. The idea that unlimited corporate cash is the right to petition the government, the refusal by the court system to stand up and halt wholesale surveillance. We are the most watched, photographed, eavesdropped, monitored population in human history, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. And yet it doesn't matter what we want. All the way back to the bailouts of 2008, constituent calls were 100 to 1 against those bailouts, and yet they went through anyway. Nobody wants corporate cash replacing the vote. Nobody wants wholesale surveillance. Nobody wants the TPP or CAFTA, which is why we are watching this utterly absurd scenario where even our elected officials are not allowed to speak about trade agreements that will eviscerate what is left of environmental working regulations and our working class. That's the game they're playing. It's a game where we don't count anymore, where it doesn't matter what our rights are, it doesn't matter what our grievances are. In the name of austerity, what they are doing to the poor and increasingly the middle class. When I sued Barack Obama in federal court over Section 21, Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which says, overturning again a constitutional mandate, that the U.S. military will be given the power to seize American citizens who, quote unquote, substantially support, that's not a legal term, that's not material support, Al-Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or associated forces, another nebulous term, strip them of due process and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. When they ran opinion polls on that section, it had a 97% disapproval rating, and yet it passed anyway. In the midst of that court case, we won in the Southern District Court of New York. The Obama administration appealed. We reached out to the Democratic leadership in the Congress, and we said we will drop the lawsuit if you will write into that provision that American citizens are exempt. And of course they would not do it, because it was written for American citizens, because they know what's coming. The combination of climate change, the inevitable speculation, the crash that will come from returning to the casino capitalism globally, they know what's coming, and they're preparing. And every single mechanism they use to strip us of our power mocks our democracy, or the facade of our democracy. When they appealed when Obama went to the Second Circuit, the appellate court, with his appeal, which he did, they sent lawyers, Judge Catherine B. Forrest, who in her 112-page opinion, when she issued her ruling, said that this provision opens up the possibility that the government can criminalize an entire category of people and strip them of their rights. And she brought up the internment of 110,000 Japanese during World War II. And the reaction of the Obama administration was to visit her chambers, not just with federal attorneys, but now with attorneys from the NSA and the security apparatus, and demand that she lift her temporary injunction until the appeal would be heard, which, to her credit, she refused. That was a Friday afternoon. By 9 a.m. Monday morning, they were at the Second Circuit demanding the same thing, and unfortunately, they lifted that injunction and put the law back into effect. And why? The lawyers, Bruce Afron, Carl Mayer, and I asked why. And I think the conclusion we came to is because they're already using the law on U.S. Pakistani dual nationals in places like Bagram. And if they could ever get out and that injunction was standing, then the government would be held in contempt of court. Now, the Second Circuit, and it was a kind of window into how the court system has become a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state. The Second Circuit had to rule on a black and white constitutional issue. And to the credit of my old employer, the New York Times, not only did they send a reporter to follow the case, but wrote an editorial praising Judge Forrest's ruling after her decision. The question was, how were they going to maintain this violation and not have to confront the very clear constitutional mandate that the military is not to be used as a domestic police force. And what they did is kind of classic of the way the courts work. I was a plaintiff in Clapper versus Amnesty International against the FISA Amendment Act, which reached the Supreme Court. And before the court, this was before Snowden, government lawyers got up and said that the charge that I and the other plaintiffs were under surveillance was speculation, and added that if we were under surveillance, the government would tell us. And so the Second Circuit waited for that ruling, and when it came through, they said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw it out, and it's law. Over and over, the system has been reconfigured into what the great political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls our system of inverted totalitarianism. And that book, which I mentioned in almost every talk I give, Democracy Incorporated, is for me the most prescient study of the devolution and destruction of American democracy, the corporate coup d'etat that's taken place, as John Ralston Saul says, in slow motion. Inverted totalitarianism, Wolin writes, is not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in a classical totalitarian regime, you have reactionary or revolutionary forces that overthrow a decaying structure and replace it. But in inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. We have now created a system internally that replicates the structure of any totalitarian society. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, writes about the precursors to totalitarian power. She herself, stripped of her citizenship in Germany for helping German Jews flee to Palestine, captured by the Gestapo, almost killed, ends up in France as a stateless person. And as a stateless person, she grasps that when a society strips a certain segment of their population of rights, the way we have with undocumented workers, or the way we have with poor brown and black people in our marginal communities, and couples that with what she calls omnipotent policing. You create internally structures that at the flick of a switch can spread throughout the wider society. The reason Sacco and I went to these sacrifice zones was to say you have to look at what's happened in cities like Camden, New Jersey, or the coal fields of southern West Virginia, or the produce fields, or our Indian reservations, Pine Ridge, South Dakota, because what these forces have done in these sacrifice zones, they will do to you. If we don't grasp what's happening in places like Ferguson and Baltimore, and remember, part of what is driving these protests is not the indiscriminate use of lethal violence on the part of militarized police who can kill with impunity, but the fact that in the name of austerity, the most vulnerable of us are being exploited economically to a terrifying degree. 30 to 40% of revenue in St. Louis County comes from fines. Fines visited on the poorest among us. Fines for not mowing your lawn. Fines for standing for 5 seconds in a crowd, or fines for not standing for 5 seconds in a crowd. Fines for taillights. And if you're poor, you can't pay those fines. And if you can't pay those fines, there's a warrant. And when you're stopped for a taillight, and that warrant means you go to jail, you run, and the police shoot you in the back and kill you. That's America. I teach in a prison, and my students have taught me what it is to resist. I've taught at some of the most elite universities in this country, Princeton, Columbia, New York University, and I have found more brilliance, more passion for the life of the mind, more integrity in those prison classrooms than at any of those elite schools. Because learning for them is not about a career. It's not about networking. Many of them know they will die in prison. It is about understanding the world around them, understanding structures of power, and understanding how to resist. I helped my students a year ago write a play. I was teaching a course on drama. We were reading August Wilson, without question, one of 20th century America's greatest playwrights. And not only as a dramatist, but just I speak as a writer. If you read his play Fences, it's like Flannery O'Connor. It's absolutely flawless piece of writing. And Wilson chronicled in 10-year cycles the African-American experience, mostly out of Pittsburgh, starting with Joe Turner come and gone. And I said to my class that first week, I'm going to have you write scenes, dramatic scenes of your life. And I brought those 28 scenes home with that peculiar smell of the prison. And I was reading through them. And 3 or 4 in, I hit one that was brilliant. And then I hit another one that was brilliant. And I had attracted probably 5 or 6 of the finest, most talented writers in that prison. And every scene was a story from their life, a chronicle of their suffering, of the criminalization of poverty, of the lack of chance, of the loss of love. One class I said, write me a scene with your mother. Just a scene with you that you remember sitting with your mother. And one of my students came up afterwards and said, what if we're a product of rape? And I said, well, Timmy, that's what you have to write. And that's what he wrote. He wrote this scene of his life. He was in a car in Paterson, New Jersey, with his half-brother. And there was a gun in the car. And it belonged to his half-brother. And they were stopped by the police. Now, if no one in the car took ownership, everyone would be charged with weapons possession. And Timmy said to the police officer, it's mine. And then he wrote a scene that was the phone call from the jail that went like this. "It doesn't matter, Ma. I was never supposed to be here anyway, and you have the son you love." That's why he's sitting in my classroom in prison. I was supposed to be writing this book, but I dropped it. I could add another night, according to the prison rules, if my students, or some of them, needed remedial help. And so I went into the classroom and I said, well, I've added Friday night now. It's remedial help night. And they said, well, how many of us need remedial help? And I said, all 28 of you. And for 4 months, that's all I did was write this play with them. And we couldn't read it. It's called Caged. We couldn't read it, of course, before the prison authorities. And so I brought Cornel West and James Cone. I hope you all know James Cone. The most important theologian in America, hands down. Cross and Lynching Tree is one of the most brilliant books I've ever read. I speak as a former divinity student. And when we got to the lobby, the warden was there, and the major, highest uniformed official in the prison. And the warden said, "You're not going to your classroom. You're going to the chapel." And when we got to the chapel, there was a dozen corrections officers in the back, the warden, the major, and of course, any full reading of that play would bring retribution down upon the heads of my students. They all gathered in a kind of huddle to decide what parts of the play they could read, what they couldn't. And I wanted to hear it, but I had to back away. It was theirs. They had to own it. And we read that, Timmy read that section himself. And when he finished, when the play scenes were finished, I asked my students, where is he? And they said, I think he's in the bathroom. And all these guys do in there is lift weights. I'm like one of the munchkins. They're huge. I went in the bathroom, and there, of course, was Timmy shaking and crying in the corner. Over and over, these stories of dignity, a student of mine, arrested at the age of 14, poor, dragged into a police station for a knifing he didn't commit. Held in that police station till 2, 3 in the morning, weeping, the boy, told that he must sign. If he signs, he can go home. They were not allowing his family to be in the room with him. He signs, it's a confession. He spends 2 years in the county jail. He goes to trial when he's 16. He's convicted. He's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70 years old. I can sit here all night and tell you stories like that. What we have done in our system of mass incarceration, which is neo-slavery. What we have done, the poor people of color in this country. He was my only A+ last semester. And when the class was over, the students left and he and I were alone in the room. And he said, I worked so hard. I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I'm going to be a teacher like you. And he walked out. This book is written for them. I learn more from them than I give them. I admire them so much. Every class I teach to them is the same. It's about revolt. It's about resistance. Baldwin, Wright, Ellison. I taught a course this spring called Conquest, Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. I gave them the syllabus, and there was a Wednesday in March that I said, I'm not going to be here. I'm speaking in Montana. I was in my hotel room in Montana, and I got a phone call from the Special Investigations Division for the Department of Corrections for New Jersey. And they said, do you know that your students just led a sit-down strike in our prison? And they said, we think you're behind it. Now think about it. Think about what that means. They knew what was going to happen, what did happen. Every single one interrogated, every single cell strip searched until they found the leaders, moved them out of the prison and put them in isolation. Tens of thousands of human beings in this country are being tortured and driven towards psychological breakdown. And yet they stood up anyway. I was so proud of them. I was so honored to be their teacher. And that's what this book is about. It's about rebellion. Because we have no time left. The climate is being, the ecosystem, degraded and destroyed at a rate that even climate scientists did not predict. The reconfiguration of the global economy into a form of terrifying neo-feudalism, the rise of a corporate oligarchic elite that cares nothing for human life. Karl Marx nailed it. Can't understand capitalism if you don't read Volume 1 of Capital. Unfettered, unregulated capitalism, which we now live under, is, as Marx said, a revolutionary force. There are no internal mechanisms of control, and now there are no external mechanisms of control, which means that they will exploit everything, human beings, the natural world, until exhaustion or collapse. And that is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. In theological terms, these corporate forces are forces of death. And it is incumbent upon us, and I speak as a father, to stand up and affirm life, no matter what the cost. Because resistance, as my students taught me, is not about what we can achieve, it is about who we are able to become. Resistance is an act of faith, a belief that the good draws to it the good, at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then we have to let it go. But it is the belief that it goes somewhere. The Buddhists call it karma. We have to stop asking ourselves what is practical. It's too late for that. We have to stop trusting in mechanisms of power because they have betrayed us. Every act that we make now, every decision that we make now must be to break the machine, including all of the political mechanisms that are used to mask venal corporate power, including the Democratic Party. I covered disintegrating societies for many years, all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the two Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. Viscerally, my anger at Bernie Sanders. Intellectually, it stems from his decision to run as a Democrat. But emotionally, it stems from his refusal to stand up for the Palestinian people. Because we live in an age where we are going to stand with all of the oppressed or none of the oppressed. In the face of corporate tyranny, we cannot pick which oppressed group is convenient to support and which is not. Because it is the language of oppression, it is the experience of the oppressed that will teach us how to resist, and that will give us the honesty and the courage to fight back. It is, and I learned this overseas as a white male and an American, it is a curse to have privilege. This is the theme of King Lear. Because you are blind, privilege blinds you. You cannot see, you cannot understand. You become self-deluded the more privileged you become. And that is the brilliance of Lear, stripped of his power, thrown upon the heath, and then he can finally see. And I'm well aware, whether I'm in Gaza or whether I'm in that prison, that my own privilege, no matter how hard I try to understand, makes me unable to see. And that is why we must connect our resistance movements to those who are suffering most within our society. The decision by much of the liberal establishment to busy itself with the boutique activism of identity politics and multiculturalism and forget the primacy of justice. As poor black and brown people in this country were stripped of the ability to earn a living wage or even exist in dignity with drug laws where omnipotent police can kick down their doors in the middle of the night for nonviolent warrants, terrorizing everyone inside with long-barreled weapons and black uniforms and Kevlar vests. Empires die the same way, always. They hollow themselves out from the inside. The most dangerous institution in America is the military-industrial complex, which is bleeding us dry, $1 trillion a year. Which is terrorizing the wretched of the earth, as Frantz Fanon says. And as our society devolves, the harsh and brutal mechanisms of control on the outer reaches of empire migrate back into the heart of empire. So a night raid in Oakland for a nonviolent drug offense looks no different than a night raid in Fallujah. Militarized drones, wholesale surveillance, tanks on the city streets of Ferguson against unarmed young men and women. That is the disease of empire, the disease that is eating at the very core of our society. And as the country sinks under the weight of a corporate oligarchic class, as the assault on the middle class continues, the assault on the working class, of course, is over. As they run out of poor black and brown bodies to put in cages, because, as Marx understood, surplus labor is worth nothing to capitalists on streets, but it generates $40,000 or $50,000 a year when you put a person in a cage. And that's why they're there. It has nothing to do with crime. Because the real criminals run the country. From Wall Street to the Pentagon, in suits and uniforms, because if you're poor in this country and you run out of a store with a package of Pampers and a six-pack, you get shot in the back or locked away for a couple years. But if you work for Goldman Sachs and you defraud poor people through subprime mortgages of hundreds of millions of dollars, you sit on trustee boards at Stanford University. I don't even know why poor people even try to commit crime. White people who look like me have nailed it. They're the finest criminals in the face of the earth. Not to mention the most efficient killers. Everything that we have done to the weak and the vulnerable, starting with African Americans, and as Faulkner knew, the original sin of this country was slavery, and it's still with us today. What we have done to Native Americans is still with us today. What we are doing to Iraqis, Afghanis, Pakistanis, Somalis is a continuation of the murderous pillaging and plundering that the white race has been on for 500 years. But the game is up. The game is up. And as Marx understood, in the final stages of capitalism, those forces pillage the very structures that make capitalism possible. And so we are seeing corporations feed off of the body politic, arms manufacturers. We spend about, we don't know, it's secret, $100 billion a year on intelligence, read surveillance, and 70% of that work is done by corporations like Bose, Allen, Hamilton, and others. The complete fusion of corporate and state power. The assault on public education. Anytime hedge fund managers become overly concerned about poor city schools, it's not because they want to teach people to read and write. It's because they know the U.S. government spends $600 billion on public education and they want it. And along with it, they want to break the back of the teachers' unions. And shove standardized testing down the throats of our children because they do not want them to be taught how to think. They want them to be taught what to think. The banks that lead the Fed, borrowing money at 0.8% interest, and then lending it back to us at about 16% interest if we're late on our credit cards. I don't know, that's not capitalism. What is it? Extortion. We have to stop sitting here and taking this stuff. We have to recognize that all of these systems are designed to crush us, and that it's time to rise up. It's time to resist. And we have to stop worrying about whether or not we can succeed. It's too late for that. Maybe we will not. I read climate change reports, many of you do. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, the effects of climate change stored in the oceans would be catastrophic. March, first month since we've recorded weather patterns, 400 parts per million carbon emissions every single day. There is no time left. And of course, the decision by the state to bombard the airwaves with effective propaganda is a form of disempowerment, a collective self-delusion, the insane positivism that reality is never an impediment to what we desire. You get it from Hollywood, from Oprah, from positive psychologists, from the Christian right. And it's all a lie. What will resistance look like? In the book, I spend time with those I admire: Mumia Abu-Jamal, Julian Assange, Jeremy Hammond, Lynn Stewart. All of those figures endowed with what the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. And Niebuhr writes that in moments of extremity, a moment of radical evil, to take a line from Kant, it is only those endowed with sublime madness, with the capacity to stand up against overwhelming forces of oppression, that will open the door for the rest of us. Revolution. Revolution, despite the popular perception, is always nonviolent. Because, as the great theorists of revolution, Crane, Brinton, Davies, and others understood, no state is overthrown until the organs of internal security, or significant portions of them, defect. The Cossacks in Petrograd, sent in to quell the blood riots, they refuse. They fraternize with the crowd. They rush the Tsar back from the front, and he abdicates in a railway carriage before reaching Petrograd. 1979, the Shah flees Iran. His armed forces, equipped, trained by the US military, lay down their weapons and do not fight, much like the Iraqi army. Somoza, Carter turns back, the 3 ships filled with weapons, they do not fight. I was in East Germany. And Erich Honecker, in the fall, September 1989, sent down an elite paratroop division to fire on the crowds of demonstrators in Leipzig, and they refused, and Honecker lasted another week in power. It is the capacity to stand up, and in the words of Václav Havel in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, to stand up and speak an undeniable truth to power. And the state fears that truth because they know internally how gamed and corrupt the system is themselves. And that is what we are called to do. The power of the powerless, Havel writes. The power to live in truth. The power to speak and exist and resist in a way that responds to the reality around us rather than the manufactured reality they create in order to disempower us. That capacity to live in truth, that sublime madness, Niebuhr writes, in moments of extremity. Liberalism, he says, is too weak, too ineffectual, too intellectual in order to respond to radical evil. It's only that sublime madness. And these rebels become vital. Ironic points of light, Auden calls them, Snowden and others, because they allow us to see. They keep alive another narrative, and they give us hope, because if you don't resist, you cannot use the word hope. I don't know if we will succeed. To promise success is a false promise. America is a very violent nation. We have a long history of white vigilante violence that goes all the way back to the slave patrols, right up to Clive Bundy's ranch. Thousands upon thousands of African Americans, Native Americans, dissidents, labor leaders. America carried out the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers lost their lives so that we could have a 40-hour work week and an 8-hour day and an end to child labor. Don't talk to me of the military. Those are our patriots. Those are those who stood up to make this country a better place and died for it. And many of them were blacklisted, tens of thousands, gunned down by white vigilantes, Baldwin Felts, Pinkertons, gun thugs. And they're there, our fascists, our gun-toting Christian right militia members who function the way fascist groups always function, diverting a legitimate rage, and it is legitimate, against the vulnerable, undocumented workers, Muslims, homosexuals, feminists, intellectuals, liberals. And they're strong and powerful, and we at this moment, because our movements were destroyed in the name of anti-communism, are starting almost from zero. And yet, as Howard Zinn understood, every opening in American democracy came from radical movements. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. The mythology we use to describe the New Deal is not history, because those radical movements, including the Communist Party, went to Roosevelt and said, either you put people back to work, you feed the destitute and the elderly, or you get revolution. And Roosevelt an oligarch himself went to the other elites and said, you better give up some of your money now or you may lose all of your money. And as Roosevelt said, he said his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. But it's time for capitalism to go. And it's only going to go if we make it go. And that means that we have got to build movements that are unrepentingly antagonistic to every aspect of corporate power. And that has as its goal, whether it's our for-profit healthcare system, or the destruction of education, or the arms industry, or the looting and pillaging by Wall Street, every action must be directed to dismantling the structures that oppress us. And that will come only by building movements that grasp that it is not our job to take power. Power is the problem. Karl Polanyi in The Open Society and Its Enemies says, the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Polanyi said, most people attracted to power are at best mediocre or venal. The question is, how do you make the powerful frightened of you? That is the only question. Because as Frederick Douglass understood, that is the only way power responds. Including that ridiculous movie about Lincoln. How can you make a movie about emancipation without Frederick Douglass? Only in Hollywood. There's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book. So it's 1971, and Nixon, remember our last liberal president? Yes, he was. Not because he had a conscience or he was liberal, but because he was frightened of movements. OSHA, Mine and Safety Act, Clean Water Act, all came from Nixon. And he's standing at a window at the White House, and he's taken empty city buses and put them end to end around the White House, and he's looking out the window, and he says, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's where people in power have to be. That's just where they have to be. And it's our job to put them there. And if you look back at American history, every leap toward justice and equality was made by movements that frightened the powerful. Julian Benda, the treason of the intellectuals. We have a choice in life between serving two sets of principles, privilege and power, or justice and truth. But every concession we make to those who serve privilege and power diminishes the capacity for justice and truth. We must hold fast to the moral imperative of justice and revolt. We must stand up. Because finally, revolt in an age like ours is about the capacity to affirm life itself. I do not fight fascists in the end because I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. Thank you very much.
Hi, can you all hear me? Oh, great.
It's been turned on. I just want to say a note to the audience before I throw a few of my own questions to Chris and read some of yours. You know, this is step one, right? Being here and hearing what Chris has to say is step one. And step 2, 3, and 4 is what we do when we step out of that hall and what we do with this information and the inspiration and actually make it come alive and not just listen, but actually act. And I think it's quite valid and appropriate that a journalist who has seen so much of the world is calling on us to revolt. Journalists are our eyes and ears to places that we can't always be. So Chris, I know that before I get to some of my questions to you about your talk today, I understand that you were recently ordained as a Presbyterian minister.
I
so
was,
congratulations.
Yeah. Well, there's a little story behind it, I'll tell.
My question, I'm just wondering is, have you started giving sermons yet? And if so, do you write them the same way you
No,
write your
I
talks?
always give sermons. That's part of the problem.
Okay, that was
I've never not given a sermon.
Okay, so tell us the story.
Because I teach in the prison, I was getting my health insurance, as the charm of living in America, through the Presbyterian Church. And then in classic institutional style, some administrators decided that since I wasn't ordained, I shouldn't be getting the health insurance. And I had done all the academic work 30 years ago to be a minister, and so is this being taped? Can I use a bad word?
It's being taped, but we can bleep away. Are there any kids in the audience?
So
Just hand
I took all 5 of the 3-hour ordination exams, including biblical Greek, and passed them. And then I had the kind of difficult situation of actually having to physically be ordained, which I dreaded the thought of, a bunch of white-robed Presbyterians coming down the aisle of some suburban church. And so I went to an inner-city church in Elizabeth, New Jersey, run by a classmate of mine from Harvard Divinity School, who's been there for 22 years, done amazing work. And I asked James Cone to come preach, and he had never preached at an ordination before in his life. And I got Cornel West to come and give the charge. And I hired a blues band and threw out the Presbyterian hymnals.
Nice.
And then I invited the families of my students from the prison. And the entire service, and it's online actually, the entire service is about them. Including, I wouldn't even read the Presbyterian prayer of confession, I wrote my own, which went like, where were you when they crucified Matthew Shepard? I was on the cross, I wasn't there. That's the response. Where were you when they crucified Malcolm on the cross? I wasn't there. Where were you when they crucified Sitting Bull on the cross? I wasn't there. And it ended up being deeply powerful, and Cone is spectacular. When I brought Cone and Cornell into that prison, they stayed after and spoke. And Cone, as Cornell says, there are only 2 great black intellectuals that rose from dirt poor poverty in America, Richard Wright and James Cone. Cone's parents, woodcutters, virtually illiterate. He picked cotton in segregated Arkansas in the summers with a burlap bag over his shoulder. He tells the story of being a young boy and night falls and his daddy's not home. And when you're a black man on a road in segregated Arkansas, and you don't get home, you might never come home. Cone got up and spoke to my students. And when I had one more class the next night, one of my students who had been on death row stood up and said to the rest of the class, you saw I was crying last night. I've been in the system since 1984. And the only happy night I've ever spent in prison is when Dr. West and Dr. Cone came to speak to us.
And when I went back into the school, they had, my students, taken a picture of Cornell and a picture of James Cone and put it up on the wall of the school because that's who they have to become. And this is the greatness of Cornell West. Cornell finished that night. And at the end of the night, he turned to the 140 students we have in our college education, and he said, I'm going to come back and teach you an intro to philosophy course. And he did. Wow. No cameras, no glory. Yeah. And so that's why, and it was real. The service was real, and my commitment is real, and it's ultimately formed out of my, you know, my faith, which is a very unorthodox faith, but it's formed out of faith.
Chris, you've talked about how in revolutions, many revolutions have had defections of internal state security. And when they switch their allegiance, that's when you can have, it can mean successful revolution, as history has shown us. So how do we make that happen here in the United States? I mean, I think of police unions. They're such a big part of the problem. They're so
Right. Well,
just
police
terrible.
unions are white hate groups.
Right. So
Oh, that's what they are. Watch them.
no, it's true.
They're white. They're right out of the Klan. I mean, look at Philadelphia or New York. I mean, look at those guys. I mean, it looked like they just took off their hood.
So how do we engage with the police forces to have them start to question the state system?
Well, because the state, what terrifies the state most is that the foot soldiers that are tasked with using coercion to keep us in check defect. Yeah. And the way that we make them defect is by stating a truth that they understand. So when Chicago teacher strikers march through the streets of Chicago and they go into the precinct houses to use the bathroom, the police applaud. Huh. When I, a couple years ago, with 133 veterans, mostly from Iraq and Afghanistan, were arrested on the White House fence, protesting the wars there, when we were cuffed, it turns out that most of those police were in the National Guard and were in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were whispering in our ears, keep protesting. The state is terrified of that. And I think one of the major reasons they passed Section 1021 of the NDAA is because they don't trust, ultimately, the police to protect them. And we saw it in Zuccotti. So the whole demeanor of the blue uniformed police changed when the white shirts, the officers, were there. Because at night in New York, they rent themselves out for $37 an hour, rent-a-cops in the foyers of companies like Goldman Sachs, and they watch these guys walk by. I used to say in their $800 suits, which I thought was a huge sum of money. But then somebody told me that, in fact, they spend like $8,000 on suits. But they watch them walk by. They know. They see. And I had battled, as you know, the Black Bloc, and called, there's a YouTube clip of me in Zuccotti telling people not to taunt the police. I'm not justifying what the police do. I'm not. I'm trying to destroy the system. I'm trying to find a mechanism to destroy the system. And while many of these cops or many of these COs are without question sadists, there's no question. We need to reach at least a segment of them who are not, because it creates paralysis within the system, which is our goal. And I said in this speech, I said, look, we only have to deal with these white-shirted assholes an hour a day. These blue uniform police have to deal with them all day long. And I gave a talk a few months later in New York, and a man came up to me and said, I'm a white-shirted asshole and I read all of your books. Now, I read King, and I should have known better. I should have never even said that. He may be the only one. But it is by appealing to the conscience of those who are in the structures of power, who see that they are defending and enabling a rapacious and unjust, a discredited elite that we have the capacity to win. And in that sense, we live in what Berkman, I quote the essay in the book, calls an invisible revolution, or what Gramsci calls an interregnum, a moment when the efficacy of the old ideas, neoliberalism, have lost their hold on the popular imagination. Congress has an approval rating of 7%, but we have yet to formulate a vision to take its place. But when we do, and I speak as a socialist, then we become powerful. And Berkman says it's like a pot that's coming to boil. You don't see it boiling, but then you suddenly hear the whistle and see the steam. And that was true in every revolution I covered, including East Germany and Czechoslovakia. It unraveled at an incredibly... So the facade appears totally intact, the Stasi state. And then it just crumbles like a sandcastle.
I want to ask one final question for myself and fold into a similar question asked by a member of the audience, so I'll ask them together. What are the examples or models that we might be able to point to in the world where there is a closer vision to what you imagine? For example, in Iceland recently, after I don't know how many years, a cop killed an unarmed civilian, and it was this national crisis, and it was just one person killed. And I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like to live in a state like that. There's, of course, Scandinavian countries that have socialist governments where social indicators of happiness and other things come so much closer to what we would like to see here. Are there some examples you can point to? And then this question from the audience is essentially the same thing. What would the attainable and ideal economic system, culture, and form of government be implemented after a successful revolution? But I think as part of the revolution, I would add as well.
Well, a redirecting of resources. So we have $5.4 billion a year, I don't know, maybe it's trillion, I might have it wrong, worldwide that's given to the fossil fuel industry. The redirecting of resources. Any society, the strength of, it's counterintuitive in a way because we're bombarded with this glorification of violence and hyper-masculinity and pornography, which is part of it. And the strength of any state is determined by its capacity to take care of its most vulnerable and its weak. That's the strength of a state. And that was true on the battlefield. It was those units that would pick up their wounded and carry them, or even would go back and not leave a body behind, that had unit cohesion and unit strength. Once units didn't have that capacity or interest in taking care of their own, they disintegrated. And that's writ large in the wider society, because when you know that you live in a state which exhibits the cruelty that our state exhibits to children, 1 in 4 of whom live in tremendous poverty, to the mentally ill, to the disabled, to the poor, to the sick, then you create a kind of vicious tank of piranhas where you know nobody's going to help, nobody's going to look after you. You become inculcated with the cult of the self. And the state that we have to recreate is one that banishes the addiction of consumerism because it can't be maintained, that makes war against the fossil fuel industry, that destroys the military-industrial establishment, which are prosecuting the longest wars in American history, not because they've been successful. Iraq is a disaster. I mean, what's worse than Saddam? ISIS. Iraq as a unified country will never come back. We've lost the war in Afghanistan. But they don't, Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman, they don't care. War is a business, and it's a very good business for them. and a very bad business for everyone else. And it used to be that in the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, people would fight weapon systems. Now they get everything they want. We just passed a House appropriation bill where they're building 12 new Ohio-class submarines at $8 billion apiece. I don't think ISIS has a rowboat. But it doesn't matter. $345 billion to upgrade our nuclear arsenal. Well, there's a really good idea. It's run amok. And we have to create communal structures, locally and finally nationally, if we're going to endure what's coming, not just economically, but in terms of climate change itself. And I would throw in here the animal agriculture industry, which is as responsible for global warming as the fossil fuel industry. And people often ask what you can do. Well, tomorrow you can wake up and become a vegan.
One member of our audience asks, have you thought of running for the Green Party? And I'm going to add, can you also share with us the fact that at least in Seattle, one person has used the electoral system, not with the Green Party, but with the Socialist Party, I'll pronounce her name the way it's supposed to be pronounced, by the way. Listen carefully. It's Kshama Sawant, because she's exactly from the same part of India that I am. I am so proud of that. Okay. There is literally a letter in Hindi that sounds like ksha. And so tell us about the fact that she has used the electoral system in a way that is so powerful that were her example to be replicated, we could have revolution peacefully through the electoral system.
Locally.
Locally, yeah.
Yeah, we're not nationally. I mean, I wrote speeches for Nader in 2008, and so I got an up-close look at all of the ways they make it impossible for a third party on a national level to run. And let me just throw out how much I admire Ralph Nader. No one in this country has been fighting corporate power or knows more about corporate power and has done so with more integrity than Ralph Nader. I think locally, but what we're watching, and I was there yesterday to help her kick off a campaign rally, is that nationally the Democratic establishment is throwing everything they have at her to defeat her, because they can't. She exposes them for what they are, and that's why I think her election is important, and because we need. But on the national level, I think we have to look to Greece and Spain. So we need a political expression of all of those grassroots movements, Black Lives Matter, the push for 15, the debt jubilee, all of these movements, the anti-fracking movement. But the goal has to be not seeing the elections as an end in itself, but by giving a voice nationally and a political cohesion to these movements. Syriza 10 years ago was polling 4%. And what we will see, we may see it by the end of the month if they can't repay, what we will see in Greece is just what the international banking system and the capitalists did to Salvador Allende in 1973 in Chile. So there will be power outages, fuel outages, food shortages. They will use the mechanism of international finance to try and crush Greece and restore an oligarchic elite. Because if Greece succeeds, I talk about it in the beginning of the book about how revolutions come in waves. If Greece succeeds, and I certainly hope they do, then Spain is next. And then the whole system begins to unravel. So I think on a local level, but I think ultimately that our political expression has to give a coherent political vision to radical grassroots movements, because we just can't be naive about how, on the national level, the system is so absurdly fixed. You know, all of the myriad of ways, including locking you out of the debates, et cetera, that essentially make it impossible for a third-party candidate to get their message out.
And is that why you think Bernie Sanders chose to run as a Democrat?
I know, I asked Bernie why, and that was his big mistake, because he won't attack, he didn't want to lose his committee chairmanships. We asked him, Shama and I know I mispronounced it, you can tutor me afterwards. She did give me permission to mispronounce it. So, but Shama and I asked him, we spoke with him and Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein the night before the climate march, and he said, his answer was, I don't want to end up as Nader, because he knows what they will do to him. They'll strip him of all his positions of power, they'll go after him within, and so what you have is this candidate who says many things I agree with, legitimizing the Democratic establishment, promising to endorse the nominee, which means that by April, otherwise he won't get in the debates, Hillary will just echo the populism of Sanders in the way that Obama did in 2008. And then in April, it's over. And so all of that money, all of that energy gets funneled. I mean, this was the role of Van Jones in the last election, back into the black hole of the Democratic Party. And so, I think his decision makes him complicit with an organization, the Democratic Party, that I seek to destroy.
I think we have time for one last question, and I'm going to read two of them because they're similar. Thank you, Chris, for telling the truth. I echo that. My question is, after the dismantling of Occupy, my hope was damaged. However, what ideas, suggestions do you have for continuing the struggle today? How to be proactive, how to keep the work going? And then another question similar, how do you personally avoid being consumed by despair given the nature of your work? And I'm very curious about that question too. Do you have any hobbies?
Do I have hobbies? I read a lot.
But probably nonfiction.
No, I read a lot of fiction, actually.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. When I read a lot of fiction. Well, Occupy was a tactic. It arose, I think it was an extremely important moment in American history. It was driven primarily by what Bakunin calls déclassé intellectuals. Now, there was that great debate between Marx and Bakunin about the role of déclassé intellectuals. Bakunin said they were vital to a revolution. Marx dismissed them. I think Marx was wrong. So these were largely the sons and daughters of the middle class, college educated, heavily in debt, who realized there was no place for them in the society. They ran smack into the injustice the white liberal class committed against people of color in this country. So while they were having their communities and their lives destroyed, we were engaged in identity politics. And suddenly these sons and daughters of the middle class got a taste of what poor people of color have known for and experienced for a long time: police repression, eviction, joblessness, and that creates a fusion that is very dangerous for the state. The fact that the state did not respond rationally to the very reasonable demands of Occupy, a massive jobs program, a curbing of Wall Street greed, right, and theft, meant that the decision to eradicate the encampments exposed the state's inability to do what a traditional liberal class does in a functioning democracy, capitalist democracy, which is act as a kind of safety valve. And that was a very dangerous moment because the state basically said, we will only speak to you through force. And it's always the state that determines the configurations of rebellion. So a rational response from the state, if it did not have built within it this self-annihilistic quality, which it now has, would have been a forgiveness of student debt, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, and a rational health care system for all. That would have been rational, as a minimum. And then, of course, they would have done what happened in the 30s, which was break the back of a radical rebellion. But the inability of the state to even act in its own self-interest is characteristic of a decayed structure. And so something's coming. We see the brush fires in Baltimore and Ferguson. We see them. What it will look like, what will trigger it, no one knows. And I learned that covering revolts, including on the afternoon of November 9th, 1989, when I was in Leipzig with the leaders of the East German uprising. And they said, maybe within a year we will have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. By that evening, the Berlin Wall as an impediment to human traffic did not exist. Even they had no idea. What saves me from despair? My students, their immense courage, watching people rise up, anger. I mean, Augustine said, hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are and courage to see that they don't remain the way they are. My children, I may fail, but at least they're going to be able to say that their father tried.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you all so much for coming and for being here today, for supporting TruthDig. And as I said before, this was step one. Step 2, 3, and 4 after you leave this hall. And we all have a moral imperative to revolt. Read the book, buy the book, support TruthDig, and let's have revolution.
Thank you very much.
This video program was brought to you by truthdig.com.